Muy buenos días, muchas gracias por estar conectados hoy. En nombre de Banco Santander, les doy la más cordial bienvenida y les agradezco su participación en este evento. Soy Claudio Soto, soy el economista jefe de Banco Santander y en esta oportunidad tenemos el agrado de contar con la presencia del doctor Joseph Henrich, antropólogo, reconocido profesor y presidente del Departamento de Biología Evolutiva Humana de la Universidad de Harvard, con quien conversaremos sobre cómo la cultura está impulsando la evolución humana, domesticando nuestra especie, haciéndonos, entre comillas, más inteligentes, en una charla que se titula El secreto del éxito de la humanidad. Joseph es una de las voces más destacadas en cuanto a biología y comportamiento humano y ha estado en Chile previamente realizando trabajo de campo hace bastante tiempo, sí, pero ha tenido una participación muy activa en lo que es la experimentación en campo, en terreno, en Chile, como les mencionaba, y en otros países de Latinoamérica y del Pacífico Sur. Queremos dar un agradecimiento especial a la Facultad de Economía y Negocios de la Universidad del Desarrollo por organizar esta actividad que permitió justamente traer a Joseph a Chile. Joseph va a dar una charla de aproximadamente 40-45 minutos y una vez terminada vamos a tener un periodo de unos 10-15 minutos para que ustedes puedan hacer preguntas e interactuar con él. En caso que tengan alguna pregunta que hacer, les pido que la realicen a través del chat, que la escriban a través del chat y yo las estaré leyendo y comunicando a Joseph para que pueda ir respondiéndolas una vez que concluya su participación. La charla será en inglés, hay traducción simultánea para que ustedes puedan acceder a la opción español. Tienen que buscar ahí en la aplicación justamente la opción para escuchar en español, o si prefieren la versión en inglés, pueden también acceder a la versión en inglés. Voy a moverme rápidamente yo a justamente la versión en inglés para dar la bienvenida a Joseph y que dé inicio a su charla. Joseph, it's a big pleasure that you're here with us. Your research is really fascinating, and I think we have a lot to learn from what you have been doing in the last years. The idea is that you can give us your talk during 40-45 minutes, and then we have 10-15 minutes for questions from the audience. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. And thanks for that nice introduction. And it's wonderful to be here with you all. Let me just share my screen. So hopefully you see the title of my book, The Secret of Our Success. And so one of the questions I want to get to today, which I think is of great practical importance to many, is the question of what drives innovation, and are some groups more innovative than others, and why it varies across countries and firms, and all the ways in which innovation can vary. But to get to that, I really want to go to a deeper puzzle, a puzzle about human evolution, which gives us a new and somewhat different understanding of humans than we've had in the past. And I think the place to start is by realizing that long before the age of industrial technology or the first cities or even the origins of agriculture, our species spread out from Africa around the globe. So we leave Africa sometime around 100,000 years ago. We get all the way to Australia by about 60,000 years ago. Our ancestors are entering Europe and encountering the Neanderthals at 50,000 years ago. 40,000 years ago, we're pushing into the Arctic. And then sometime after that, we enter the New World and get all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. In the course of this expansion, we adapt to an immense diversity of environments, from the malarial swamps of New Guinea to the Arctic tundra of Siberia and later Canada, the arid deserts of Australia, the tropical forests of the New World, and the marshes of Tierra del Fuego. And we do this not the way other species have done it, by adapting genetically to different adverse environments, but we develop tools and technology and know-how to fit ourselves to these different environments. And to just show the striking contrast between humans and other animals, we can look at the most successful species of the invertebrates, which is the ant. So ants adapted to an immense diversity of environments and dominate the biomass almost as much as we do by speciating into 14,000 different species. So they have specialized genetic adaptations for all the different kinds of environments that they inhabit. But we're a single species that is relatively genetically homogeneous, despite having expanded into all these diverse environments. So this, I think, is beginning to set up a puzzle. Now, a lot of people think they already know the answer to this puzzle, which is that we humans evolved big brains, and these big brains are good at solving individual problems. So we're rational, we can figure things out, we build causal models of the world, and this has led to our species' success. But I just want to begin to make the point and get you to think about this a little bit differently by pointing out how much of a struggle we have even to survive in the environments in which we evolved. So the available data from anthropology and other places suggest that we lived as hunter-gatherers for about 2 million years. So if there's one thing that these big brains should be good at, it should be surviving as hunter-gatherers. But my colleagues and I have put together a lot of cases where humans end up in environments where hunter-gatherers do quite well and flounder, but are unable to survive in these environments. So just to give you one example, and Australians all know about this example, but it's the case of Burke and Wills. So around 1960, the Worthies in the then town of Melbourne, Australia, wanted to send out an exploration team that would go across the continent to the Gulf of Carpentaria and also plot a possible course for a telegraph cable and come back with what they learned during the journey. So they appoint Robert Burke, the head of the team. And to make a kind of long and interesting story short, the team is broken into two parts. There's a 4-man team that takes off from Cooper's Creek here in about the middle of Australia. And then there's another resupply team that is going to meet them in that same place. So this four-person team takes off. They take 12 weeks of food with them. And they're having a lot of struggles along the way. And in particular, one of the interesting things is they've imported camels from India. So this is a well-funded expedition, and the camels are helping out. After about 8 weeks, remember they had about 12 weeks of food, they smell the salt air of the Gulf and they declare victory that they've made it. They didn't actually see the Gulf, but they turn around and begin to head back. They run out of food and they begin to try to forage on the land and hunt, and they're having trouble getting enough food. Burke ends up shooting a guy for stealing the group food. But coming in months late, they do eventually arrive back in Cooper's Creek, although along the way, some of their camels escaped. That'll be important later in the story. The morning before they arrived, the resupply team, which had stayed a month past when it was supposed to, headed back to Melbourne and had given up the four explorers. So Burke had to decide whether he was going to try to chase the other group or head to a ranch and police post by going west and following Cooper's Creek. So they were tired and hungry, and so they decided to take care of the rations that were available, the foods that were available there. And then they began to follow the creek towards the ranch and police post. Almost immediately upon this new direction they were heading, their last camel gets stuck in the mud and dies. And so this essentially strands them along Cooper's Creek, because without the camel, they can't transport enough water to cross the open desert that they would need to cross to get to the ranch and police post. So they're basically trapped here because they don't have the knowledge to find water in the desert. Now they begin trying to live as hunter-gatherers. This fails. They're starving to death. They can't make the relevant tools. They don't know which plants to eat. So they're really struggling to survive as foragers. Now they encounter some of the local aboriginals, the Yawantru tribe. And while in one of the camps, they see some of the women processing what they call a seed. This is actually a sporocarp. And they realize you can make cakes from it. So they go out and they find some nardu, that's the seed, and they begin to make some cakes. They get occasional gifts of fish from the Yawantru. So things begin to look more hopeful. It looks like they're going to make it. But what they didn't know, or what they didn't pay attention to when they were in the Yawantru camp, is that the women grind up this sporocarp, this seed. They leach it and heat it and use a mussel, or they grind it, leach it, and then bake it in ash. And the reason for this is that nardu is toxic and undigestible, and it has an enzyme called thiamines if you don't process it properly. So it eventually causes an awful disease called beriberi, but you essentially starve to death on a full stomach because they were eating more and more of this as they were starving. So Burke and Wills eventually die. The third man, King, stumbles off into the bush and is eventually rescued by the Yawantru, and then a rescue party from Melbourne comes and gets King. And they find Wills's journals in the outback. So that's how we know the story. So this is an interesting case because humans have lived as hunter-gatherers in Australia for at least 60,000 years, as I mentioned. But despite these big brains and this long evolutionary history as hunter-gatherers, these guys can't figure out how to survive. They can't learn how to find food. And it wasn't just that they had bad luck with Nrna. There's hundreds of other foods they could have eaten and poisoned themselves. So for example, they could have poisoned themselves on this Moreton Bay chestnut. They encountered this plant called spinifex, which they could have used to make hunting tools. But they didn't know that you have to carefully take off the crystals from the spinifex, mix it with the dung of a wallaby or maybe a kangaroo, and that allows you, when it's heated in a fire, to make a powerful adhesive that's really useful for making tools. And the reason they didn't know this is because unlike a local adolescent who would have known all this and also how to find water in the desert, they weren't bequeathed a large body of knowledge from their forebears, from the people who came before them and before them. This accumulative body of cultural knowledge really seems to be the key to our species' success in these different environments, including the arid deserts of Australia. And if it seems like the arid deserts of Australia are too hard a case for a species like us, I'll point out that those camels that escaped from Burke and Wills, they beat the Lost European Explorer challenge in the sense that the central Australian desert is full of feral camels now. And the feral camels survive because they have powerful detoxifying abilities in their digestive system. They can smell water from a mile away and innately know what to eat, unlike humans who can't detect toxifying foods and can't process them without the cultural knowledge. So we're really dependent on this cultural information just to do a basic thing like survival. So the camel outcompetes us. Now, another way to get at this question is to look at recent research from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. So what Mike Tomasello, Esther Herman, and their colleagues did is they took 3 ape species, so orangutans, chimpanzees, and 2.5-year-old humans. My son Josh here is our representative 2.5-year-old human. And they gave them a battery of 18 cognitive tests. Now, these cognitive tests can be divided into 4 different subtests for display here. And you can see in this graph, I have the performance of each species. So the higher the bar, the larger the percentage that they got correct on tasks about space, if you look at the first one. And you can see that when you have to solve a problem about space by using that cognition, that brain, and then you get a reward for it at the end, so all 3 species like treats, humans and chimpanzees aren't very different, and orangutans are just a little bit worse. When it comes to using quantities to solve these problems, the chimps edge out the humans, although it's within the margin of error. Something like causality, the chimps edge out the 2.5-year-olds again. And if you were to look specifically at tool using, you would see the chimps do much better than the humans. So there's not an obvious difference in the cognitive abilities of 2.5-year-old humans in these apes, except in one domain where the humans go to ceiling and the apes go to floor. And that's in the area of imitation, or learning from others by social learning. So this points to the idea that we as humans are really specialized, not with brain power to solve individual problems, but with the ability to learn from others, that we're fundamentally cultural. Now, you might think that it's a little bit unfair to use 2.5-year-old humans, we're using adult apes. But when you do this across the age range with both species, you find out that humans get massively better at these tasks as they get older. So if we were to put adult humans into this, they would blow the roof off the tasks and get 100% pretty much in all the tasks. But the apes actually don't get better. A 5-year-old non-human ape is about as good as a 25-year-old ape. And that begins to point to what I think is going on here. The argument that I'm making here, that I'm going to hint at, is that humans accumulate culturally transmitted solutions that allow us to solve these problems. And I'll say more about that in a second. It's also not just these tasks. So I could show you other experiments looking at working memory or the ability for strategic thinking, and the apes either perform about as well as humans or even a little better in some cases. So what makes us smarter is this gradual set of pre-built solutions that we have. So things like springs and screws and levers and pulleys were all things that have developed over historical time and that we learn about as children, and then we can redeploy them to solve new problems. So they make us better able to solve problems. A famous example is the wheel, which is only invented in Eurasia. So it's never invented in Oceania or Australia or New Guinea. And It's very useful for carts and eventually used for pottery, but it's really only invented 6,000 years ago, so relatively recent in our species history, but then of course very powerful. The same thing with with elastically stored energy used for something like bows and arrows, never invented in Australia. New Guineans invented elastically stored energy, but they didn't invent fletching for bows and arrows. Things like numbering system, lots of societies count 1, 2, 3, many. But once you can count to 27 or count without bounds, all of which we inherited without much effort as part of our counting systems, you can solve all kinds of novel problems. And of course, the number 0 as a placeholder for nothing was only invented twice, once by the Mayans and once in India. And it comes into Europe rather late, actually. Pink circle freedom. So my argument is that the secret of our success and also of innovation is not our raw intelligence, but our culture, our ability to acquire ideas, beliefs, and values from other in a cumulative fashion. So over time and over generation, we build up this ever growing body of cultural adaptations, of innovations, of ways of doing things. And once you accept that as the potential source of a lot of innovation and ideas, that means that we essentially operate as groups or as societies. We have a collective brain. Larger and more interconnected populations or groups will share more ideas, they'll generate new recombinations of ideas, and they'll produce more rapid innovation and larger repertoires of tools. And this hinges on ability to learn from each other in a high fidelity way, in a way that preserves the information across time, and also on our sociality, on interacting with a large number of individuals and allowing the information to flow, which requires trust. I'm not going to get into this last bit, but this leads to a process of gene-culture coevolution, which in The Secret of Our Success, I argue, explains many aspects of our physiology and biology, as well as our psychology. Now, this slide I just wanted to illustrate one quick point, that a lot of times the way we think about this, we think of genetic evolution occurring on one hand, and then cultural evolution as something different occurring on others. But the evolutionary approach that has emerged in the last 20 or 30 years, we use the logic of natural selection and the evolutionary thinking that has been so successful in explaining the natural world and in designing vaccines, for example, to think about cultural evolution and how people learn. So we're thinking about the evolution of our capacities for culture and how that gives rise to cultural evolution. So just to give you a little taste of how that works, we can take the logic of natural selection and say, how should people learn? What's a good way to acquire the knowledge that's available in the minds of others? So simply we might copy in people who are more prestigious or successful or who are more competent. And that means over time, we're only copying a subsample of the previous generation, and that's going to make it better and better over time. We also know that kids and adults are especially interested in some domains. So like fire, food, artifacts, young children are interested in living kind. So that's why sometimes they're interested in dinosaurs, for example. We also have specialized ways of thinking about social norms and social groups, which help us with this process. So there's quite a bit of evidence, and my favorite kind of evidence here comes from young children, where you can show that even young 2-year-olds will key in on and preferentially learn from those who are higher in skill, more successful, show cues of prestige, meaning other individuals are watching them and paying attention to them. Younger children tend to copy older children, and in many places, people learn from the elderly or learn from much older people. I can say more about that if people are interested. There's also cues to learn from those whose roles you're likely to have later in life. So boys tend to copy boys, girls tend to copy girls, even before they can say whether they think they're a boy or a girl. And people also copy those who share their dialect. So even young children will preferentially learn from people who speak a dialect similar to mom's, and other ethnic cues guide learning. So this can lead to the differentiation of groups as a consequence. And this occurs in a wide range of domains. So everything from food preferences, even suicide can be imitated where people copy method and it diffuses through networks, as well as social motivations like fairness and punishment. So it's a very powerful feature of humans in terms of our behavior. Develops early and reliably, so we see it in children under 1 year old. Okay, now I wanted to bring this back to innovation. So here I'm drawing on one of my colleagues at Harvard, Raj Chetty, and his collaborators. And what they did is they looked at the database, the patent database. So they have 1.2 million inventors. And you can see there's a lot of variation across the United States at the county level or at the commuting zone level. But we can use that data to ask questions about cultural transmission. So for example, if your parent is an inventor, you're much more likely to be an inventor, meaning to get a patent in this case. So you're 9 times more likely. So 18 out of every 1,000 children, if you become inventors, if their parents were inventors, whereas only 2 out of 1,000 if your parents weren't previously inventors. We also know that this is sex biased. So when fathers are inventors, they tend to produce sons who are inventors, whereas when moms are inventors, they tend to produce daughters who are inventors. So that's that sex biased copy. Now, interestingly, people might think that all this has to do with genetics. It's an obvious hypothesis that, you know, smart parents have smart children, and so they're more likely to invent. But what goes against that idea, there's Bell and Chetty make a number of arguments against this, but one simple piece of evidence that might relieve you of that concern is that children patent in the narrow domains of their parents, where their parents patented. So if their parents patented in semiconductors or transistors, then the kid patents in semiconductors or transistors and not all the other things. So that's what this plot shows, is the similarity in the domains. Almost all the kids' patents are in the same domain or a very close domain as to their parents. So there's some kind of transmission there that's very particular. But the community you grow up in is also important. So if you look at the adult patenting rate for a county or a commuting zone in the US, a person who grows up in that zone is much more likely to later have an innovation and get a patent than a kid who grew up in a county where hardly anyone innovates. And this is true even when they track kids who move. So if you move from a non-innovative county into an innovative county, then you're much more likely to patent if you grow up there. So you're affected by the milieu. And again, the technology classes tend to apply. So if you move to Boston or California or San Jose, then you're likely to get a high-tech patent or patent in the domain of computers. Okay. And the argument here is that this is due to the collective brain. That what's happening here is that most inventions are recombinations of different ideas coming together. And so it's not our raw intellect, but our social and our cultural natures. So our cultural nature is the fact that we learn from others. And our social nature is the fact that we can live in groups and build relationships. So that's doing a lot of the work here. So just to mention what I had said before, genetic evolution gives rise to these capacities for cultural learning. We learn from different people, pull different ideas together, and that can create a recombination process that eventually leads to technologies and adaptations. Now, this is important not just with patents in the modern world, but it goes deep back into human evolutionary history. So to test this, 2 anthropologists, Michelle Klein and Rob Boyd, they got data from from the islands in Oceania on the marine foraging technology. So this is from early ethnographies and explorer reports and things like that, from 10 different societies. And if the prediction is true, then we should see that islands with larger populations that were more webbed into other islands, connected to other islands, they should have more tools and fancier tools. And that's what we find. So the horizontal axes on these plots is the log population size. And the vertical axis in the first plot on the left is the number of tools. So that's the number of different marine foraging tools. And you can see that larger populations had larger numbers of tools. The same thing goes for the average complexity of each tool. So not only did they have more tools, but they had more complex tools. And this gets at one kind of caution that I often give to my friends in paleoanthropology, is that many scholars are inclined to infer how smart a group is by how fancy their technology is. But in Oceania, this is a recent human expansion in the last 5,000 years. And some people ended up on big islands and some people ended up on small islands. The people who ended up on big islands produced fancy tools and lots of them. People who ended up on small islands didn't produce very many fancy tools. But we know, because it's a recent expansion, that there's no innate differences among these groups. What this is the collective brain at work. And if you have a big island you can have more fancy tools. The other thing that comes through in this data is that islands that were more interconnected are above this line, which means they're extra inclined to have fancy tools. And that's because you can, through interconnection, you get additional ideas. All right, now, I'm trying to develop ideas that are important for understanding the broad breadth of human history. But if we want to think about the modern world, the same basic logic applies. So this is combines data on population sizes of different US cities and information from the patent database. I could do this for basically any year and it would show roughly the same thing. This particular data is like 1970s to 1990s. So bigger cities produce more innovations, but this is logged on both the vertical and horizontal axes. You don't have to worry about that. But the main point is that if the slope of the line is greater than 1, it's called superlinear. And what that means is that it's as if each person gets smarter. So if you move to a bigger city, you're not just make that city more likely because you're one more person who could have a good idea, but you're more likely to have a good idea that ends up in a patent if you move to a bigger city. So you're getting some advantage, or so somehow the collectiveness of the urban area is making you more innovative. Now, a natural concern with this, it could be maybe people who are more inclined to have inventions tend to move to bigger cities. So you might worry about that as sort of explaining what's going on here. So to deal with that, my colleagues and I have done a series of experiments. And what we do in this experiment is we take undergraduates and we put them into one of 2 treatment groups. And so you have a set of undergraduates who come in, they have to solve a difficult problem, and then they can pass information down to the next generation. And then we do that for 10 generations. So we create a kind of little mini society. And we have one case in which you can only learn from one other person in the previous generation. So it's as if you can only learn from your mom or dad. And then the other group is more social. You can learn from anybody in the previous generation. So you can go out and sample around. And in this task, what the participants had to do was to use a notoriously difficult image editing program to reproduce this image that you see there. And you have a time limit, you're paid for your performance and for your students' performance. So there's some incentive to pass down useful information. And you can write up something for your students for it to be passed down. So the next generation gets the product, whatever it is you actually made, and hopefully it looks like the target, although you'll see sometimes it doesn't. You get their write-up, which is the tips from the teacher, and they're financially incentivized to pass on good stuff. And you get the target image, so you can see how good the person was. And this is what we find. So on the horizontal axis is the 10 generations. So the first generation doesn't know anything, and they just got to start figuring out the problem. When you only have one person you can learn from in the prior generation, you see the blue line. The group doesn't get better. But when you can learn from anybody in the prior generation, you can learn from some of the best, some of the people who did better, and you go from a 20% skill rating to over an 80% skill rating. So you get this big increase in average skill of the group. Now, people are randomly assigned, so there can't be anything about intelligence or anything like that. This is purely a social effect. So by 10 generations, the 10th generation is 2 or more times better than the less social group. So this is all about collective brain. Okay, so that can't be selection. Now this gives you a quick look at the data. So on the right, you have the data from the 1 model group where you could just copy 1 person. And on the other side, you have the 5 model group where you could copy any of the 5 people. And each line is a generation. So you can see the first generation did well for the 1 model group, and the first generation did poorly for the 5 model group. But then the effective cumulative cultural evolution takes over. And by the time you get to the 10th generation, so at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that every single person in the 10th generation is better than the best person in the one model generation. So they all look much smarter, even though all the difference is they were more social. The system set it up so they could be more social. Now, in this approach, the collective brain approach, cognitive diversity is crucial because different individuals are bringing different ways of thinking, different approaches, different areas of knowledge, and then you have a better chance of creating a recombination. Now, the tricky part, of course, is that people who are very cognitively different often don't get along, for reasons I actually deal with in The Secret of Our Success. So this is what we call the paradox of diversity. Huge benefits in terms of innovation can be difficult socially. I just want to give you some examples here because I'm going to make the case now that immigration has been a major driver of innovation in the United States, and that failures of the US to harness immigration have led to declines in innovativeness. So one, you might be familiar with these guys, Sergey and Larry. So Larry Page meets Sergey Brin when he goes to Stanford and needs to get a tour of San Francisco. Sergey is the tour guide. And so as a more senior graduate student, he gives a tour to this potential student, potential future graduate student. Sergey Brin was born in the Soviet Union, and he's the son of Russian mathematicians, Russian Jewish immigrants to the US, grows up in Maryland. But this is just one story, but the data now we have from the patent database is pretty clear. So since 1970, immigrants to the US are 16% of the inventors, and they have 30% of the patents. So they're particularly oriented towards patenting. A 1% increase in immigration of university grads boosts innovation patents per capita by between 8 and 18%. So a big boost to US innovation from immigration. And crucially, and this is the point I'm going to hammer, immigrants make the locals more innovative. So you might think, well, when the immigrants don't innovate, maybe some native-born Americans get to immigrate. No, they just don't do anything. It's the synergy between the two that drives the innovation. Just to give you another more recent example, some of you may have taken advantage of these mRNA vaccines. Well, the idea for that mRNA vaccine, so the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, were first developed by this Hungarian immigrant who came to be a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Katalin Kariko. But for decades, she worked on this idea that she could use mRNAs to command cells to make particular proteins, because that's what messenger RNA does. But she kept getting her grants rejected because the human body will typically destroy foreign mRNAs. So as a practical matter, it didn't seem like a technology. Until she met a guy born in Massachusetts, Andrew Weitzman, and he figures out how to tinker with the mRNA to make her initial idea work. And then the answer are, some of our most powerful COVID vaccines as a consequence of immigration. Now, you can also make decisions that lead to the loss of knowledge. So let me just show you how we looked at this in the lab. And so this is a simple experiment where we trained up the first generation of undergraduates to tie a complex series of rock climbing knots. And we just kept training them until they got really good. So you can see in our 2 treatments, we have our 1 model treatment where you can just learn from 1 person, and our 5 model treatment where you can learn from 5. They're both pretty good when they start. But then over generations, information is lost. But it's lost more rapidly when you can only learn from 1 parent instead of being able to sample from everyone. And so in the more social, the more collective brain world, you get a higher level of skill. So these hit equilibrium, and the 1 group is just maintaining a higher level. The more social group is maintaining a higher level of skill. We have lots of examples, and we know it's not incentives or because everyone's incentivized, or intelligence because people are randomly assigned to treatments. Now we have lots of case examples. So famously in Tasmania, the Tasmanians had sophisticated hunter-gatherer technology, which they lost. Meanwhile, across the Bass Strait in Victoria, the hunter-gatherers there kept getting more sophisticated technology. A similar thing happened with polar Inuit. So this has been important over time. But the question is, could policies and other decisions that reduce sociality also affect innovation in the modern world? So another bad policy of the US in terms of innovation turns out to be prohibition. So you can see a sign here in English that says, "No booze sold here, booze hounds stay out." And this fascinating research done by Mike Andrews. So as some of you may know, the United States banned alcohol from 1920 to 1933. But what many people don't know is the states began to individually ban alcohol sales starting in 1910. And at the time in US history, saloons, basically bars, were social hubs, and people frequented them from all over, new arrivals in towns would have their mail sent to the local saloon. So it was really a place where there was a lot of social mixing of people from all different social strata. So engineers would interact with craftsmen and whatnot. And so I like the prohibition example because this shutting down of the saloons would have broken all these social networks and stopped people from interacting. But of course, alcohol doesn't always have a great effect on our cognition and our thinking. So you could imagine this story going either way. So it tests the relative importance of individual brains versus social brains. And what Mike's able to show, so different states do it at different times. So he zeroes in on when states change from not having prohibition to having prohibition. And on the vertical axis is just patents per capita. And on the horizontal axis is the number of years before and after prohibition. And you can see once the saloons are shut down, patents go down. And then it continues for at least 5 years. And eventually people figure out a way around this, but it declines by between 8 and 18%. And another more subtle look at this is to look at which counties within the same state are affected. And Mike is able to show that it's really the wet counties that had lots of saloons where you see a big decline in patents. The dry counties where people weren't using the saloons too much anyway have a more milder effect. He further demonstrates this hypothesis by showing little impact on solo inventors. Most of the loss in patents is due to patents that would have had 2 or more names on them. And then finally, he takes advantage of the fact that different ethnic groups coming to the United States have different inclinations to go to the saloon. So my ancestors, Irish and Germans, were big saloon people. So their patents would have been inhibited. People of Jewish descent and Greek descent don't tend to go to saloons, or at least they didn't back then. And so their patenting wasn't affected. Okay, so that's one example. Around the same time, the US did another thing, which would have inhibited its innovative ability. And this is the Quota Act of 1924. So this was a decision to restrict immigration, to try to restore the ethnic composition of the US from 1890. So it was a restriction on different groups to keep them out. And what these economists, Petra Moser and one of her collaborators named San, did is they looked at the fields that had been previously patented by Eastern European immigrants, who were then kept out by these new quotas. And they show that there's a 68% decline in patents in the subsequent years after the quota. And this continues till 1964. So invention, and they also show a decline by native-born Americans. So people who would have been born also didn't patent in these fields. So basically, the US just stopped contributing the way it had been in these fields because there was no recombination with the immigrants bringing in ideas that could be made use of, like the Mnra vaccine or like the invention of Google. And just to put a fine point on this is a picture of Nikola Tesla. And Tesla has over 300 patents. Perhaps his most salient one is he came and he tried to convince Thomas Edison. He's from Serbia, so he's from Eastern Europe. He tried to convince Thomas Edison to use AC current instead of DC current. Edison had his own way of thinking and was unpersuaded, but eventually Tesla found the son of some German immigrants named Westinghouse, and literally electrified the world by beginning power with alternating current. So Nikola Tesla is not someone you would want to keep out of your country. Okay, so there's these quotas reduced U.S. patenting for 40 years until 1964, when the U.S. opened the doors to widespread immigration. And analyses in the 1970s show that what I previously said, that a lot of new patents are associated with immigrants from Mexico, China, India, and the Philippines, so that immigration continues to be the wellspring of American innovation. So just to give you one sense, from 1975 to 2010, an additional 10,000 immigrants generates 22% more patents every 5 years. So a big effect on that. Now, in moving to close here, I want to emphasize that it's not just immigration. You also have to have certain psychological factors in place. And a key one is trust. So you have to have, diverse cognitive diversity, but people have to trust each other and cooperate enough to share ideas, to take advantage of that cognitive diversity. it's pretty well established in economics that this generalized trust, this willingness to trust strangers, has a big effect on income per capita or just basically economic production. I'm showing here the cross-national evidence. In a second, I'll show you some more local evidence. So this allows this flow of knowledge, trust allows this flow of knowledge between diverse minds. Other psychological traits like nonconformity, individualism, and suspiciousness of tradition have also been shown to encourage innovation. So this is just trust in strangers in Europe, different European, not countries, but regions. So you can analyze this just within European countries without the comparing countries. And you can do it among US states and you get the same answer. So trust seems to be generally important for economic growth and prosperity, but it's operating in part through its effect on innovation. So my final example that I want to share with you is the effect of CEO trust on firm innovation. So this is in the US again, and we can take firms, the patents made by firms, and where we know the inventors and we know the CEO. And what Qiu Trang did here was she connected patents to firms and CEOs, and then she connected CEOs based on their last names to trust measures that are associated with different places of origin. And then she analyzed just looking at the same firm. So this isn't differences among firms. This is the same firm when they change CEOs. She's got over 3,500 public firms and 700,000 patents, and looking at the change over time. And what this plot shows, so the key thing is to look at year 0 here. That's when the CEOs change. And firms either hire a CEO that is more trusting of strangers or less trusting of strangers. And when you hire a CEO that's more trusting of strangers, that firm then gets more patents. And when you hire a less trusting CEO, you get less patents. So a standard deviation change in trust leads to a 6% increase in future patents. Now, she also did an analysis where she looks at the CEO's bilateral trust. So, do Koreans trust Japanese? And if the inventors are Japanese and the CEO is Korean and they're distrustful, then you get a decline. So she actually can match it up and show a similar pattern by looking at those kinds of differences. And then finally, the impact, 6% may sound small, but the impact is actually on the high risk patents. So the picture that she defends is that when the CEO has generally trusting or trusts the inventors, then they're allowed to embark on risky projects, and risky projects often or sometimes end up in big payoffs. Risky patents, well, important, well-cited patents. All right, so I'll close up. I just was drawing on some ideas developed in The Secret of Our Success on the importance of the collective brain for cumulative cultural evolution in general, sort of our species' ability to move into diverse societies, as well as things like innovation. And this applies to small-scale societies and to the modern world. So I used a bunch of US examples. The idea is to get more educated or more heads in the game. We need people at the knowledge frontier. So obviously education is part of that. Cognitive diversity is powerful. You can show this in experiments. I was using the patent database, but you can also give people problems to solve and show that this has important impacts. Trust in strangers is crucial. So you need that impersonal pro-sociality where you trust people you don't know and don't have relationships with. And the policies matter. So I showed you how the immigration quota mattered, and I showed you how the prohibition policies matter. But there are ways to build trust. So there's a growing body of understanding that's in psychology and economics about how certain kinds of rituals, intergroup competition, and other kinds of things can promote trust. And there's also evidence showing that patent systems are most important for their teaching function. So when someone patents something, they're telling everybody else how to do it in a sense. And you don't want to have too long of a window of essentially monopoly. That's not doing much work. All right, so that's all for me.
Well, thank you, Joseph. Super interesting your talk. Now we open the floor for questions. No sé si alguien tiene preguntas del público. sino yo tengo varias preguntas, Joseph. En primer lugar, quería preguntarte sobre cómo cambia tu visión respecto a la transmisión cultural, el hecho de que hoy día tengamos Internet y que podemos estar súper conectados instantáneamente con cualquier parte del mundo, sin la necesidad de los flujos migratorios como ocurría en el pasado.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the first thing is I do expect these informational technologies to have a positive impact on innovation. And lots of other communication technologies, including, the printing press, had big and important effects on innovation. But there are some potential problems with the internet. First is, there's the trust issue. You're not always sure what kind of information you're getting, whether it's trustworthy. So it gets back to trust and sharing. People have to be willing to share their ideas. Of course, there continues to be language barriers that need to be overcome. But the other thing that might be important is that although we can transfer information on the internet, and it often has to be conscious in the sense that if you read the sort of history of fancy ideas and innovations, it's people often don't know what they need to know until they interact with somebody in an informal situation. So a lot of times there's discussions, the initial part of a discussion occurs at the coffee machine when two engineers or something meet at the coffee machine. Or like I talked about the prohibition stuff, it occurs at the saloon. People aren't going to the saloon in order to swap ideas about how to do nuclear fusion better. But it may be that you meet someone who you didn't expect to meet, and you get a tip off about what they're working on, and that clues you into new possibilities. So the internet and these kind of sources are not good at giving us the informal and unexpected, the kind of mass action that we get other times. How important that is remains to be seen, because obviously it's a big boon for lots of direct transfer reasons. There's one other piece of the theory, though, that I think is important to bring up, which is that I've emphasized the importance of interconnectedness, and I think that's been crucial for most of human history, because what societies have always struggled to do is to get together and remain interconnected and trusting and having good relationships. They tend to fall apart. But theoretically, it's possible to be too interconnected. And one of the things I'm thinking of here now is when people have a question about how to do something, they'll often Google it or go to find a YouTube video, which means they don't do any initial experimentation, which means that if the ideas that are out there are not the best idea, but they're the best one that you can find when you do your search, you end up doing it that way, it kind of works. There might be less exploration of new avenues. So there's experiments showing that if you're too interconnected, you can go up a suboptimal peak. So you figure out how to do something, you don't figure out the best way. If groups are only partially connected, different groups are independently trying things, and there's a better chance that someone will find the optimal peak instead of some suboptimal peak.
Muy bien, gracias. Bueno, hay muchas preguntas de la audiencia. Voy a tratar de hacerte 2 o 3 de las que hay por acá. Una, te voy a hacer 3 preguntas que no están necesariamente relacionadas y después podemos seguir. La primera es respecto a la imitación y si es necesario realmente entender lo que uno está imitando para que se produzca progreso y transmisión cultural, o la imitación mecánica puede de todas maneras dar buenos resultados. Eso es lo primero. Otra pregunta está relacionada con el impacto del sistema judicial. Preguntan cómo el marco legal y las normas jurídicas pueden incidir en la forma como nos relacionamos y cómo aprendemos y cómo se transmite culturalmente, ¿no es cierto?, el conocimiento. Esa es una segunda pregunta. Y la tercera pregunta que te quiero hacer es, bueno, aquí es una pregunta un poco más general relacionada con la anterior y se refiere a cómo el ambiente definido de una manera amplia condiciona cómo se van produciendo estas transmisiones culturales. Y ahí yo te quería hacer una pregunta mía personalmente, que está relacionada con el tema de la desigualdad, porque en Chile estamos teniendo una discusión política muy intensa respecto de la desigualdad del país. Latinoamérica en general es una región bastante desigual. Y la pregunta ahí es cómo esto de alguna manera incide a través de la generación de confianza o a través de la segregación de grupos sociales en la posibilidad de que haya una mayor transmisión cultural. Ahí te dejo esas 3, 4 preguntas.
Yeah, well, let me address the last one first. And so I think inequality plays a really important role here for a couple of different reasons. One is that, you know, the idea of the collective brain is that we want to bring as many diverse minds together. You have to have sufficient education to be at the knowledge frontier. So things like inequality, whether it be ethnic groups or gender inequality, means that the society is not maximizing its potential collective brain size. So I gave you the Nrna Vaccine, you know, which the female Hungarian scientist is crucial. She's mainly the most important person. And obviously, if you didn't have women as scientists, you wouldn't have the Mnri Vaccine. Mary Curie is a similar case, right? She's the only person to have won 2 Nobel Prizes and basically discovered radiation. She is from Poland. She's not actually French. And she was an immigrant to Paris, where she met with Professor Curie, who she married. And you know, he was a great scientist, but not in her class. And together they kind of rewrote the textbook on that. So you know, just bringing the more people you can bring into the collective brain, the more you empower innovation. And any kind of barriers that prevent making use of all that cognitive diversity is going to reduce your rate of innovation. There's lots more evidence. In fact, that paper I mentioned by Raj Chetty and Bell and colleagues, they actually go through that and they look at, you know, how many innovations we lost by not having, you know, women with college degrees or African Americans fully integrated into the collective brain. So there's that. Jumping to the imitation question, one of the things I spend a lot of time on in The Secret of Our Success is to show how you can generate cumulative cultural adaptation without people understanding what all the parts do. And we now know that's true of things like bows and arrows that the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania use today. I provide lots of examples in the book, but it's even true of modern innovation. So one of the examples I sometimes use in these talks is the United States government created something called Fog Bank for their Trident's nuclear missiles. And they did this in the 1970s, and they made a whole bunch of this chemical catalyst. It came 2000, they had to refurbish the fleet, but they forgot how to make the Fog Bank. I mean, they had the instruction book, but there was something about the process that wasn't making the chemical that they needed. And then dumping, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars to try to solve this problem, which if they didn't solve it, that would have been the end of the nuclear, you know, the nuclear fleet. They figured out that they didn't actually understand the process they put together, that there was impurities had to be in the mixture, that they were trying to get the impurities out, and the 21st century's ability to get the impurities out was better. So they were removing these, quote, impurities, but they were actually crucial chemical ingredients. So the nuclear engineers had misunderstood the technology that they had made. And they eventually did figure it out, but it's a case where they didn't understand what they were doing, but it still worked. So this goes all the way from hunter-gatherers to nuclear engineers. Oh, and the third one, I guess, was about laws. I don't think there's any doubt that different legal structures affect innovation in important ways. The main one that I've looked at is the patent case, where a lot of economists think that you've got to have, you've really got to incentivize the inventor. And the research that I've seen, with the exception of pharmaceutical industries, you don't seem to need that as much as people think. And in fact, a lot of the Industrial Revolution took place without, you know, didn't involve patents or involved patents only weakly. The main function of the US patenting system seems to have been to provide a little bit of protection, but mostly to disseminate information. So the US patent system required people to specify in detail how they did what you did. So then that means everybody else can go look it up and then improve upon it.
Perfecto. Voy a ver si hay una pregunta adicional. Había una pregunta respecto del futuro. ¿Cómo es la evolución futura del desarrollo humano, dadas las tendencias que estamos viendo hoy día? Y ahí también voy a agregar una pequeña pregunta mía que está relacionada con la pandemia. Hoy día estamos teniendo esta charla de manera virtual, ¿no es cierto? Y hay una gran tendencia al teletrabajo, ¿no es cierto?, a trabajar a la distancia, justamente relacionado con lo que tú planteabas antes, que mucho del conocimiento se genera a partir de estas interacciones más espontáneas que se dan en las conversaciones de pasillo. Entonces, la pregunta en el mediano plazo, ¿cómo puede incidir la pandemia con la evolución y el desarrollo cognitivo? Y dos, ¿cómo ves tú las grandes tendencias de mediano y largo plazo?
Yeah, I mean, I think that move to remote work is a real concern because I think my recommendation is we need to research it because I'm biased, right? So I have my own biases. My bias here is that the informal interactions matter a lot. But I can't show you a regression analysis or some detailed statistical analysis. I can point to lots of cases where informal interactions led to some great idea and someone ran back to their office, or two people started talking and next thing you know, they're writing on whiteboards and outlining, some new idea that they've gotten. But how that cashes out statistically and what the costs and benefits are, I don't think we know yet. Pandemics in the past have always reduced innovation. But this one, we've never had this kind of technology before. So it'll be interesting to see how hard innovation gets hit in a world with Zoom and in a world with all this ability, email and ability to transfer information. It should mitigate it. Whether it mitigates it completely or not, I think is an open question. And then how remote work affects innovation in the future is something we got to study because it could reduce innovation in the future.
Bueno, te queremos dar las gracias, Joseph. Ha sido una charla tremendamente interesante. Aquí hay mucho material para seguir pensando, para ajustar nuestros paradigmas, nuestra forma de pensar también, de cómo entendemos el funcionamiento de nuestras sociedades y también cómo nos relacionamos con nuestro entorno y nuestra comunidad. Bueno, ha sido un placer. Queremos agradecer a todos los participantes de este evento, de este muy interesante seminario, su participación y quedan invitados a nuevos eventos que realizaremos durante el año. So, thanks, Joseph.
Thank you. Gracias.